So then in the future, we transact on this data, right? We exchange digital assets, which represent virtual assets or real assets. We have some CryptoPunks over there, right? It's kind of two in one. By way of coins, tokens, that I can issue, anyone can issue, P2P, most likely anonymously. So how are we going to govern this? Who's in charge? The machine?
No. So this is the hard question. This is the relevant question I think everyone's wrestling with right now. And I think that the point of it is we've got to realize that we're asking this question from a perspective of a previous set of technologies. So we were asking this from the perspective of nation states and other sort of mechanisms like that. I think there's two aspects to this. One is where the governance goes. And at the moment, where our governance goes is we write it in legislative books, we embody it in people. It's just a handmade governance that's crafted, and then we build nation states around it and firms and so on. Where we're going with this is platforms, is that the governance gets hard-coded into the platforms itself. We've seen this already. I mean, the word for that is a protocol, right? And we put more and more governance into protocols, and then there's the question of how do we change protocols, and that gets us into this question of the role of voting and forking and updating and so on. But the broad sort of notion here is if we can do that, the thing that this then creates the possibility of is which platform. Right? We can have multiple platforms. You don't have to have, if you're in this geographical space, you have to use that single platform. We can decouple this relationship between physical space in the world and the governance platform upon which things are trading and running. And so where I think this goes is competitive platform governance. And some of this will come from existing large tech companies and so on, stitching these together, or consortia, things like the Facebook thing that we've seen in the past week coming into that space. But there's no real limit to that notion of competitive platform governance. And the reason that I'm sort of optimistic about this scenario of multiple platforms coming into the world is that strong ones should drive out weak ones, in the sense that you always want to choose the strongest governance to locate your economy, your trading on. Right, so you'll always pick something good and strong. It's the same reason that companies choose to locate in Switzerland and not random other country somewhere else, right? Because this is where governance and institutions are strongest. You always choose strong. And I think that same dynamic will play out in competitive platform governance on a blockchain economy, that we can expect to see competition at the margin of embedding high quality institutional governance into platforms. And essentially that's a market competitive process, but for governance.
Great. I thought that was brilliant. I think this is one of the most fascinating areas that we're working in at the moment. And when you think about the technologies that we're sponsoring or the teams that we're sponsoring, a lot of what you talk about is sort of what on-chain governance do you have, what off-chain governance do you have, and there are some really interesting experiments or projects going on about decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, and what Tezos is doing here, and Aragon, and many others. But I think a lot of that thinking is actually a little bit naive, because if you think about where we have come from as a culture, as a society, the last big evolution in that kind of organizational structure came during the Enlightenment, with things like the Republicanism movement and the American Constitution and all those sorts of things. And that idea that, you need an executive branch, you need a legislative branch, you need a judiciary, a means of resolving disputes, and how all of those things work together, and as a means of sort of creating something, I think is really, really interesting.